What's up, guys? We are back with yet another video. This time, this is another video that is by request for Araumi of the Dead Tide. I swear these cards need to come with like phonetic ways to say the name. Araumi of the Dead Tide is a legendary creature merfolk wizard with a really cool effect, which also came out in Commander Legends. Again, a set that I've talked about on this channel that had a lot of commanders that are just forgotten about. So this commander has a very unique effect where creatures in the graveyard gain Encore, but to get that you have to exile cards, from your graveyard. So you tap Araumi, exile cards from your graveyard equal to the number of opponents you have, and then target creature in your graveyard gains Encore until the end of the turn. The cost of Encore is equal to the cost of the creature. So what Encore does is you're going to exile that creature and pay the Encore cost. Then you're going to create a token copy of that creature for each opponent you have, which I think that is freaking awesome, because if you do it right, you can literally just kill people out of nowhere. Of course, you're going to need a lot of mana and you're going to need cards in your graveyard, but this is a deck where you can hit hard, hit fast, no one sees it coming, and you got to make it count, because with this deck, the creatures get sacrificed at the beginning of the next instep, but they do have haste, so this is a way to give creatures haste in blue if that's something you're into. But going through what's on EDA track, you have a lot of decks. So there's a mill strategy, which of course is really good. You want to send cards from your library to your graveyard to kind of just fill up your graveyard to have access to these creatures, to have access to these cards to exile, which can be really, really fun, kind of like a high risk, high reward style deck, which is pretty much what this is. But you can also mill your opponents too at the same time. So with that, you're kind of just pulling from everyone's resources with the mill deck. But then you also have self mill, which is what I was saying to begin with, which is just putting your cards from your library into the graveyard to fill up your resources to get those cards, to play those cards. The mill overall is a very good way to go. You want to mill. With self mill, there are cards that can help you with that, like Surveil and Dredge and other cards that just, like Entomb, that just put cards from your deck into your library, and you can choose what it is, or you can just put cards off the top of your deck just randomly and just go for it. Graveyard is also really good, where you're filling up your graveyard. You might have some reanimator strategies, which could also be really fun with this, instead of always using the Encore, because maybe you want to have the mana. You can just use reanimator strategy since you're in black, and then from there you can just hit people with creatures in your graveyard, which is already a strategy that you can do. You don't really need a Araumi for that, but it is pretty fun. Sacrifice, we've talked about before. Sacrifice is fun because you get to sacrifice creatures on the field, and then you're putting them into the graveyard, and then you're using Araumi's effect to then bring them out again. But I don't know, Aristocrat is kind of the same thing, more the same. Party is interesting. The party mechanic is based on creatures you have in your party. So wizards, rogues, warriors. I did a whole deck on parties. I can't remember. And clerics. There we go. Wizards, warriors, rogues, and clerics. There's a lot of party mechanic synergies with them, which is pretty fun. Merfolk tribal, since Araumi is a merfolk, you can go black-blue merfolk. Merfolk are sea creatures if you're new to the game, and there are quite a few mono-blue merfolk that have really great effects, but there really isn't too many options at blue and black. There are a couple blue-black merfolk, but merfolk are a really strong tribe with a lot of synergies for each other. And then lastly, there's a zombie tribal deck, which I think that's very interesting, because zombies do play in those colors of blue and black. But the thing that I'm not noticing here is artifacts. Another option that you may want to have with Araumi are artifacts. You can put in some really good artifact creatures, and artifacts fill up your graveyard with artifacts, where you can get a lot of mana ramp from artifacts. Especially in blue and black, you don't really have a lot of ways to get lands from your deck to the graveyard, but you do have a lot of ways to get artifacts from your deck to the battlefield, and you have a lot of ways to use artifacts to then get lands from your deck to the battlefield, which is a good strategy. And then there are a lot of really powerful artifact creatures, like Blightsteel, Darksteel, Colossus, creatures that we'll get into in the next segment. But also there's another one that's not listed here, which is Eldrazi. Now this is a little bit more on the high end, and I would say this is a little bit more for advanced players, but if you feel up to it, Eldrazi's with Araumi would be amazing, and you may even give someone a heart attack if that's your goal. With the artifacts, you can do it too. There are a couple artifacts that are 11, 11, 12, 12s. You know, like there are artifacts that are 9 and up in power and toughness. But when it comes to Eldrazi's, you have a lot of Eldrazi's that are also like 7 power and toughness and higher, to where you even get into the 12s. So it can be really cool if you are able to do something where you get 3 of these creatures, these really big creatures, something like Desolation Twin, which I'll go into in that segment, where it is a 10/10 Eldrazi that makes a 10/10 token, because it's a twin, so it makes a copy of itself. But with that, you can go into having 4 of that. So you would have 4 creatures that are 10/10, 3 of them with haste. You know, like it could be so crazy to see the reaction from people. So I'm not going to get into it too much further, but let's get into the stats and talk about these 2 ways that you can play this deck that aren't listed on EDHREC. Alright, so since Araumi is a unique kind of commander that has been out for a while, I would definitely look at doing this a little differently. A lot of people have already kind of set on cards that would be great for Araumi, but it feels like Araumi has fallen to the wayside. It might be because Araumi is one of those, once you've seen it once, you know exactly what's going to happen type of commanders, which makes me worry about longevity for this commander, at least, where they're always going to have good new tech cards, but how many times are you going to be able to pull off these combos? Or, you know, how many times are people going to be able to see your win con that's always the same and just go, okay, I'll just hold my counter spells, or, you know, I'll hold my Bajuka Bog until I see them get the card they need in their graveyard type of thing. So the way that I would look at this is by first thinking outside the box. Of course, for me, when I think outside the box, I always think about it in a colorless perspective. I just simply love artifacts. I've said that many times. They can do everything. So that's where I look for things first. And I think the first card I want to talk about is probably the best card that I think partners up with Araumi, and that would be Eloise. So if you're not familiar with Eloise, was from the recent zombie precon from Midnight Hunt. Eloise is one of the backup commanders to that to that precon. She is a 5-drop Dimir, blue and black, human rogue legendary creature 4/4. Whenever another creature you control dies, investigate. So since you're going to be encoring, that's 3 triggers, 3 investigations, and when you investigate, you create a colorless clue artifact token with pay to sacrifice the artifact and draw a card. So her next effect is whenever you sacrifice a token, surveil 1. Surveil is like Scry, but for the graveyard. So with Scry, you would look at the top card of your deck and you choose it goes either back on top of your deck or at the bottom of your deck. And Surveil does the opposite, where you look at the top card of your deck and it either goes back on top or it goes in the graveyard. I prefer Surveil over Dredge and Mill personally, just because Dredge and Mill are kind of just random, and I don't want to lose cards that I need on the field, like mana rocks. I don't want to lose draw cards when my hand is empty, type of thing. And then it's like, yes, that's great, I'll be able to have those to remove them for the encore cost, but I also want to be able to use these cards. I want to keep my mana rocks so that way I can keep paying for the encore cost, but I also want to have my instants and sorceries so that they can be used and go to the graveyard to then be exiled, since you can only activate the effect of Araumi at sorcery speed. So Surveil is something that I think is a great way to build the deck around. Surveil didn't have a ton of support, but for the support that it did have, it does have some really good cards. So while talking about Surveil, there were a couple good cards that I wanted to point out. One of them being House Guildmage, Notion Rain, and what was the other one? Lazav, the leader of the Dimir. So I will get into those three. House Guildmage is a good card that's just a creature. You don't want to encore it, you just want to have it on the field. It's a 2-drop 2/2 human wizard, and its first effect is pay 1 and a blue, tap it. Target creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step, which can help you attack with your creatures that you want to encore. And then its second effect is pay 2 colorless and a black, tap it to Surveil 2. With a card like this, you're going to get those triggers out of it. You want those Surveils. You want to tap down an opponent's creature, so that way when you encore, you have a way to get through if you don't have unblockable or flying or some form of evasion, menace, etc. So I think House Guildmage is a great, probably every turn type of card where you can just keep using that Surveil 2. And then of course with Eloise, that's just going to enhance things. So you're kind of just pairing them up. The next card being Notion Rain. Notion Rain is a sorcery that has Surveil 2, then draw 2 cards, then Notion Rain deals 2 damage to you. The Surveil 2 is a great, like I was just saying about the Guildmage, you want to choose what's going into the graveyard. You want to play this card so you can draw 2 cards, so you can choose what's next if you want to keep it, if you don't. Choosing what's in your graveyard, being very choosy, so that way you don't just fill up your graveyard and then someone Bajuka Bogs because they had it in their opening hand and you just lost like one of your win cons, And the last card being Lazav, that I want to talk about from Surveil, where when he enters the battlefield, you Surveil 1. He's a 2-drop legendary creature. But his second effect is the one that I think is really good for this deck, because if you go with big creatures like I want to do, you can pay X and he becomes a copy of that creature that goes to the graveyard. So, you can use this to get some of these big creatures, and this is a good segue to talk about the creatures that you want to put into your graveyard. So when you're doing your surveils, and there are other ways of course to fill up your graveyard with specific creatures, but when you're doing your surveils and you're seeing cards that you want in the graveyard, you want to be very precise. You don't want to show your hand per se and let everybody know, hey, I'm playing Eldrauzis, or hey, I'm playing really big artifact creatures, or I'm playing heavy sacrifice aristocrat type strategies with like Plague Crafter or something. So when you're thinking about creatures that you want to have creatures that you're going to get value out of. And by value, I mean like not just encore them, draw cards, and they're gone and your field is open. While those seem very tempting, thinking about the crackback in my meta, at least with the people that I play with, I would die if I did like 3 Mole Drifters, drew 6 cards, and that was the only thing I did, and now Araumi is the only creature left on the field. Like, I would just die next turn. So thinking about things that you want to die that you get benefit out of would be creatures like Triplicate Titan. Triplicate Titan is a artifact golem that is a 9 cost. It's really big. This is why I said you want a lot of artifact ramp, or mana rocks at least. But he costs 9, but when he enters the battlefield, he has flying, vigilance, and trample. And when he dies, you create 3 colorless golem artifact creature tokens. One has flying and is a 3/3. The next one is a 3/3 with vigilance, and then the last one is a 3/3 with trample. So when you think about that, if someone board wipes because they're like, oh, you played a 9/9 creature, I don't want that on the field, you still get 3 3/3 creatures after he dies. And then if you encore him from the graveyard, I mean, you can only imagine what's going to happen next. So, getting 3 Triplicate Titans, then when they get sacrificed at the end of the turn, you're going to get a whole bunch of tokens. Like, this is just something I'm saying, like, not leaving yourself open to the crackback, having an army and then doing damage. If you're going to be a threat, learn how to defend yourself on the opposite end. Another card that I would say would be good to have is Phyrexian Triniform. Phyrexian Triniform is a card that also has Encore on it, but when it dies, you create 3 3/3 golem artifact creature tokens. So even though it already has Encore on it for 12, it's a 9 drop for 9, 9/9 for 9. Sorry, that's just something, like I said, keeps your defenses up. Even if it's dying or if you're sacrificing it, using the Encore, exiling it, you're not going to get that creature back. You can't just bring it back from the graveyard again, if you've encored it. So unless you're playing a Reanimator, which would be a completely different deck, unless you're playing Reanimator, then, you wouldn't need to encore. So Encore is kind of like a high risk, high reward type thing. So you want to get the most out of these creatures, and you don't want to leave yourself open. The last artifact creature that I would advise, at least for something that could have a lasting effect, would be Maelstrom Colossus, which is another golem. It's an 8-drop 7/7 golem that just has Cascade. So for 8, you're cascading into another card, but when you encore it, you cascade for 3. You're going to have 3 separate cascade triggers. So you could cascade into something else that's less than 8. That's something that could really help you out. You could cascade into, like a Mirror Battle Sphere, which is 7, which is going to get you a bunch of cards on the field. And then when it dies, you can encore it, get more mirrors. That's something that's going to give you a lasting effect. You could always go into something else. And then having something to benefit off of these creatures dying is also going to help you progress the deck. So when you're looking at stuff like this, if you're going this route where you want to have value, look at a card like Aetherworks Marvel. Aetherworks Marvel is a artifact 4-drop. Whenever a permanent you control is put into a graveyard, you get an energy token, energy counter. You can tap Aetherworks Marvel, pay 6 energy counters to look at the top 6 cards of your library, and you may cast one of those cards without paying its mana cost, put the rest at the bottom in a random order. So what some people used to do with this in standard was they would use Aetherworks Marvel to go into an Ulamog Eldrazi. This is something that you can take with you, where when you encore, you're going to get 3 counters. Those tokens still hit the graveyard before they disappear by the ruling. So you're going to get 3 energy counters, and then plus, if you played the creature before you encored it, that's more to it. So when you have cards like Triplicate Titan or Phyrexian Triniform, you're going to get those extra golem tokens at the end, and if those die for any reason, you're going to get a whole bunch of energy counters. So you're going to be able to essentially look through your deck and be able to just play stuff for free. Also, getting back into Eloise, you're getting a whole bunch of stuff. So even with Aetherworks Marvel, because it just says when whenever a permanent you control goes into the graveyard. Eloise will be giving you clue tokens by investigating, and you'll still be surveilling. So even when those clue tokens hit the graveyard, you're still getting energy counters. You're still being able to get value. The value just never stops. So looking at stuff like this, looking at Eldrauzi's, looking at big, artifact creatures, you don't want to go with legendaries, because when you start making copies of those legendary creatures, like the Eldrazi Titans, for example, which will be up on screen, you don't want to have them or creatures like them. It would be really cool to have something like Darksteel Colossus or Blightsteel Colossus, or like some of the other Eldrazi Titans, but unfortunately they have a effect where when they go into the graveyard from anywhere, you shuffle it back into your graveyard, or you shuffle your entire graveyard back into your deck, and that's not what you want with this deck. So be wary of cards like that. While they look very tempting, they're not actually going to help you at all. Lastly, I kind of want to get into some other things. So like, if you want to specifically put a card into your graveyard, what would you use? Of course, there are some things where you just like, I'm getting towards the end, I need to just put my win con into the graveyard, or I need to search for my win con. Cards that can help you with that are cards like Entomb, Buried Alive, and Final Parting. Entomb lets you search your library for a card and put it into your graveyard. Buried Alive does the same thing, but you can choose up to 3 cards to put into your graveyard from your library. And then Final Parting allows you to search for 2 cards. One goes into your hand, the other goes into your graveyard. So with those 3 cards, you have a good way to search for something specific. If it's getting towards end game and you have Entomb in your hand, or Buried Alive, or Final Parting, and you feel like you're ready to go for game, everything's lined up, you have enough mana, all the stars are aligned, and you need to send one of your win cons, which is Grey Merchant of Asphodel, to the graveyard so you can encore it. That's how you would do it. You hold on to those cards and you wait to use them at the last moment, but you don't want to keep doing that every single time. So when people start to see you with Entomb or Final Parting, they know that the game is going to end. So there are a couple other creatures that you can use that have similar effects. One of them is Vile Entomber. It is a zombie warlock, 4-drop, 2/2 creature with Death Touch, which is pretty good. And it has, when it enters the battlefield, search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. Another card is Ulrich Lore Mage, which is a 4-drop 3/3 human warlock that has tap to search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard, then shuffle. If it's an instant or sorcery, put a +1 counter on Ulrich Lore Mage, but we don't really care about the instance of sorcery part. We mostly just care about the putting a specific card into our graveyard. So those are 5 cards that you can use to just fill up your graveyard. And then of course you want to draw into cards so that you can get to your other win con faster, which is Torment of Hailfire. Torment of Hailfire is a really good card, I would say, for an additional win con if Grey Merchant of Asphodel is not available at the time, or maybe you just haven't gotten into your cards and you have Torment of Hailfire. You can end the game that way. You could pay X for like 20, 30, 40, who knows how much mana you might have at that time, but that's just another good way to have a win con, to pressure your opponents, empty their hands, empty their fields, make them take a bunch of life damage, and clear the way for you to, encore a creature, maybe finish them off, or maybe even just finish them off with Torment of Hailfire if you have enough mana. Speaking of win cons, I wanted to go into one last thing about Grey Merchant of Asphodel. When you're building a deck like this and you have Grey Merchant of Asphodel as a win con, you might want to play a couple more permanents like enchantments that can help you get that high devotion cost, so that way you can finish off your opponents. Some of the cards that you might want to look into would be like Dark Prophecy, Dictate of Erebos, Grave Pact. Those cards have pretty good devotion to black. Dark Prophecy having 3 pips of black devotion, Dictate of Erebos having 2, Grave Pact, etc. A couple other cards might be Phyrexian Arena and Whip of Erebos. Phyrexian Arena and Dark Prophecy are cards that get you draw. Phyrexian Arena lets you draw at the beginning of your upkeep and you lose a life. Dark Prophecy is whenever a creature you control dies, draw a card, lose a life. So that way when you encore, you still get draws. Whip of Erebos gives all your creatures lifelinks. That way you can get a whole bunch of life. In case if you want to use it for something else, maybe you might want to use a card that lets you pay life for something, that might be helpful. And then of course you have Dictate of Erebos, so that way whenever your creatures get sacrificed, your opponents have to sacrifice. So when you encore, this is the same thing for both Dictate of Erebos and Grave Pact. When you sacrifice your tokens at the end of the turn after you encore, that's going to be 3 sacrifice triggers, which means your opponents will each have to sacrifice 3 creatures on as triggers. So that's going to clear out the field. Like I said, you don't want to have to deal with a crackback. So this is just a couple different ways to help you, and that's kind of where I'm going to leave this. There are a lot of different ways to play Araumi, and I think that the community has spent some good time with it, but I haven't seen anybody focus on Eloise and Araumi. I feel like are a perfect commander lieutenant pairing that you just want to have on the field. I like just seeing the two of them interact and just thinking about the possibilities of how I could speed up the deck or how you could add in other things. Really makes me excited for a commander like this when I see it, because I think about a whole bunch of different things. And while this commander has been out for a bit of a while now, I haven't really seen any new tech videos on Araumi, and I think that there are a lot of different ways you could take Araumi. You could do Araumi Energy. There's enough blue and black cards in Energy where this could actually be a thing. There are a bunch of other ways you can do things too, but just the fact that you have these options, there's potential for mana ramp, there's potential for token generation, big creatures and stuff like that. Like, just from what I've talked about today, I feel like this deck could really survive. But then again, I still wonder, how many times will you be able to win if everybody knows how you're going to win? And how many different win cons can you come up with that are different from just the same thing that everyone's seen multiple times? You kind of lose your surprise factor after a couple times of you winning the exact same way, and then people start to hold their counter spells and like, oh, I'm just gonna wait, I'll wait till you do this and then I'll counter that, or I'll exile that card from your graveyard before you do because I don't want you to win, type of thing. How many times can you play this deck until that becomes an issue? But I think it'd definitely be a fun deck, and I think it's definitely interesting. So I made a list of cards that might be good. I kind of made a deck that's on Arcadeck, which you can check out. The link is in the description below. I don't think this deck is too pricey. The deck list that I made was under $200. But if you don't really need like the Grave Pacts, the Dictate of Erebos, if you find other ways to do things that fit your needs, or maybe that are slightly different, or maybe that use other cards that aren't so popular, I think you could really find your own niche with this commander, because this commander is really cool, and the thought of getting the multiple tokens is really good too. There are a lot of ways to keep the tokens, like Sundial the Infinite and a couple other cards that allow you to just keep the creatures, so that way they don't get sacrificed at the end of the turn. But if you build towards the sacrifice as well, like with Louise and with Aetherworks Marvel and a couple other cards that focus on death triggers, you know, you can kind of maximize those death triggers or the ETB triggers at the same time with Panharmonicon, etc. You know, like we saw with Phyrexian Triniform and Triplicate Titan, maximizing those death triggers could come in handy, where if you copy it, you could possibly get a bunch of creatures and have an explosive turn and go for game, or you could just, you know, draw 6 cards and hope for the best, you know. So it depends on your meta, depends on your play group, depends on the people that you're playing with and the power levels that they're at and how focused you make this deck. But overall, I think it's a really good deck. I think the commander is really cool. I really like Eloise, and I think this is Eloise's home right here with Araumi. And yeah, that's it. So enjoy the deck list. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.